started. This is the May 18th, 2022 Fifth and Avon Community Advisory Committee. This is the call to order. This meeting is being held in pursuant to and in compliance with emergency ordinance number 20A16, an emergency ordinance to ensure the continuity of government during the COVID-19 disaster. The committee members who are present, I guess I need to read these out, are Mr. Finley, myself, I'm gonna murder this name, Sean, correct? So is Sean here? And I don't want to is it Bridge?
It's Bridge, yeah. It's
Okay.
it's just spelled difficultly, yeah. Sean Bridge.
Okay.
All right. Good to meet you, Nathan.
Hello, good to meet you. And I hope at some point we'll be meeting in person. I'll get to meet all you in person. So
That'd be great.
Miss Davenport, Roger, again, I don't want to mispronounce the last name, so you can, okay. And Craig Roller, correct? So I think that's who we have as members of the committee.
Okay, you're gonna have to appoint someone to take minutes tonight since your secretary is not here.
Yeah, so we need, so our secretary is not going to be here today and or the next meeting in June. So will somebody be willing to step up and take the minutes?
I'll do it.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. I appreciate that.
And Andrew Baxter is present. I'm not sure if you mentioned Andrew.
Oh, Andrew, I'm sorry, I missed you, Andrew. My apology.
It wasn't my name that intimidated you, was it?
No, no.
And I don't think you mentioned Karen Davenport, who's also here.
Yeah.
We got that one.
So let's see, next step would be to committee business, and that would be to adopt the minutes, but I guess we don't have a quorum, so we can't adopt the minutes. So I guess that would be pushed to the next meeting to adopt the minutes from when was our meeting in March? Is that how that would work, I assume?
Yep. I did have one change to the minutes. I know we can't adopt it, but very, very value added change. In the date line, it says March 2017, 2022. I think it's supposed to be March 17th, 2022.
There we go.
So.
Okay. Does anybody else have anything they need to address in the minutes from March?
Place that on the next month's next meeting you have for.
Okay, yeah, so we'll approve those minutes at the June meeting. Okay, next on the agenda is the climate action plan for Albemarle County, and that's Gabe Daly. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Daily, yeah.
Okay.
Like
you are the
daily newspaper.
Okay, you are the climate protection program manager. So you have, I guess, a presentation that you wanted to show us or provide, whatever. So I'll give you the floor.
Sure. Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, thanks everybody for having me tonight. I'm just curious, before I do the screen share and jump in with the presentation, just kind of curious to get kind of a sense, like the county's climate program manager coming to do a presentation and have a conversation with the Fifth and Avon Community Advisory Committee. Like, what's the first kind of thought that pops into your mind at having one of your meetings on this topic? Just curious.
I'll jump in. It's an overwhelming. Hear me okay?
It cut for a second, but I heard the first
now?
kind of the key word.
We're good now? Yeah. No, I would just say for me as a member of the committee, but also just as a human being in 2022, it is an overwhelming, looming light coming through the tunnel. That's a train that's headed towards us. It's very, very serious.
I would echo that. I mean, it's part of my business, though. I'm an architect, and we've been focused on sustainability since the beginning of our firm 30 years ago in Charlottesville. So it's good to see more the government coming up to the same level.
Karen, it looks like you're muted. I think you're actually not
Yeah,
connected
still
to
can't.
the audio somehow.
No. Oh,
Well, I'm hopefully I'm happy to kind of move along unless anyone else has anything burning to jump in with. But Karen, I would be very interested in hearing what you were going to say. Hopefully you can maybe get the audio sorted out just over the course of the presentation part, and then yeah, excited to have a conversation with you all a little bit in just a little bit. So let me pull up the screen share, and thanks Roger and Andrew for kind of what you chimed in with. Let's see. All righty, can you see my full screen? Excellent. So thanks again for the opportunity to come and chat with all of you this evening. So like Nathan mentioned, my role with the county is as the Climate Protection Program Manager. And I'm going to share about kind of 4 different parts. There's 4 different parts to my presentation. I'm going to say a couple things just to frame the discussion, actually building a little bit off of what Andrew and Roger mentioned. And then I'm going to share a little bit about kind of an update for the climate protection program overall at the county, what we're up to. And then I'll talk a little bit about some intersections between climate action locally and the comprehensive planning process, which gets to kind of the reason that I'm here in part in May of 2022. Staff and community development had invited me to go to each of the community advisory committees this month to talk a little bit about some of the intersections between local climate action and local comprehensive planning since the comp plan process just got kicked off. So that was kind of the impetus behind the timing of joining you all. And then lastly, I'll share a few ways that you can get involved with our local climate action efforts, including a new kind of tool and user-friendly area that we have on the Albemarle County website. So to start, just to say a couple things to frame the discussion. You know, I heard a couple of people mention that word overwhelm. I feel like I hear that more and more lately, and often in kind of policy spaces or sort of government, you know, professionals. Sometimes the you know, feeling side of things can be left out. You know, maybe we don't want to talk about that stuff, but there's more and more research saying that it's really helpful just to acknowledge as we get into conversations about, hey, what's going to happen and what can we do about it. And so I just want to put these 3 ideas out there at the beginning of the conversation before I, you know, get a little bit wonky with all of you on the policy side, just to say, you know, it is big. Climate change is big. It can feel overwhelming. And acknowledging that, I think, is important and can help us move towards constructive action. And then the third thing is that you all can be part of the solution. Particularly, it's interesting, you know, speaking with folks who are on these community advisory committees, because there's maybe a little bit of additional agency that you have being in somewhat of a leadership position in the community, being able to provide direct feedback in the way that you do to members of the Board of Supervisors. So you have agency, and we'll talk a little bit more about kind of some of what that can be towards the end. So our climate protection program at the county, I'm going to start with just a little bit of context of the last couple of years and then talk about what we're up to now. So some of you might know that the county has a climate action plan. Climate action planning is something that a lot of localities started doing in the late 2000s, early 2010s to try to be prepared for climate change and also try to help reduce its severity. So Albemarle County adopted a climate action plan in 2020. Rather, the Board of Supervisors adopted it. And that was based on several years worth of work among staff across the organization, local community partners in the business community, nonprofit community, other partner entities, and also generally members of the public, giving us feedback and folks working together to create a number of strategies and actions, which I'll talk about in a minute. The plan overall has several key themes that run through it. And those themes are intended to be in alignment with the Albemarle County's vision and community values. So, you know, we want to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions through the strategies of the plan, but we also want to make sure that we're doing that in a way that increases local health and well-being, helps the local economy, helps conserve and protect the local natural environment, and promotes equity and inclusion in terms of, you know, outcomes and the ways that folks can be involved and participate. The plan has two main high-level targets that the Board of Supervisors adopted in 2019. The first is an interim target, and that's to reduce emissions by 45% from 2008 levels by 2030. And the second is to achieve zero net emissions by 2050. For those of you who may follow the climate topic over the last number of years, those two targets are in line with the international standards that have been recommended by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and often are targets that you see in a lot of other localities, cities and counties across the United States. The Climate Action Plan has several different sections to it. And if you can excuse me one moment, I'm just going to close my window because I got a little bit of noise coming from the background and don't want it to distract all of you or me.
It's actually good noise.
If it was. So
It's nice to hear the birds.
Yeah, the cheeping was generally, I like it, but when sharing a presentation, it started to get a little distracting there. So the plan is divided into 5 sections. We have actions that are related to transportation and land use, actions related to building energy use, and those look both at renewable energy generation on site, so rooftop solar, for example, as well as efforts to increase the energy efficiency of our buildings. And that can include weatherization, better insulation, and more energy efficient appliances, from small things like light bulbs all the way to, you know, bigger ticket items like furnaces. We also have some actions in the plan that look at renewable energy sourcing at a larger scale. There's a little misalignment with the photo since that's a rooftop solar installation on the Crozet Public Library. In that chapter, though, we're looking more at actions to support and promote larger scale solar systems, solar utility systems. And then we have a section on sustainable materials management that largely looks at recycling and composting, and also reducing and reusing materials before they head towards the waste stream. Finally, we have a section on landscape, natural resources, and agriculture. And that looks a lot at conservation and promoting good practice in terms of our land management in the county. I wanted to give you a brief visual. If you remember from 2 slides ago, I mentioned those targets. So this is just a visual of the targets ahead of us, and also the county's past greenhouse gas emission inventories. Most recent inventory was done in 2018, and we're committed now to do them every 2 years. So we're currently working on our 2020 inventory. There's always a 2-year lag in when we can when we can look at the data and share it with the community from the actual year in question. And that has to do with when certain larger data sets are made available by the state government and the federal government that we use to do the calculations. But you can see that we've had a little bit of a reduction in emissions before the Climate Action Plan was even adopted, and something that we were working on between 2008 and 2018. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that if that's of interest. And then looking ahead with the dashed line, it's of course an idealized line. We don't know what the curve will actually look like, but that's heading towards our targets. And so you can see that we've had some reductions, but we need to steepen the downward slope a bit to make those targets. So that's just a little bit of context of where we are. And then what we're currently working on, the climate program has 2 main streams of activity that I'm basically responsible for managing. And I work a lot with different colleagues across the local government organization. Those 2 streams are on the left. There's implementing our climate action plan. And then on the right is climate adaptation and resilience planning. And so the county's climate action plan is focused on what sometimes is referred to as mitigation. And that basically means reducing our contribution to climate change, hopefully reducing the severity of climate change. And then climate adaptation and resilience planning recognizes that there's some amount of change that is baked in that we're already experiencing, and more is likely to come. And so how can we be prepared as a community? How can we build resilience in the face of the kinds of more extreme and more frequent extreme weather events that we're likely to face? In terms of our implementing the climate action plan, there's both work on the kind of community facing actions, and then there are actions in the plan that focus on local government and helping to ensure that, you know, we're leading by example in our operations. So that's some of the work with respect to that. I wanted to show this visual chart, which is kind of a simplified version of something a little more complex that we've been using a web tool to create, just to help us keep track of how these streams are dividing and informing each other in terms of the different aspects of our work. So this just gives you a little bit more visual of what I mentioned. I'll share very briefly that within implementing the climate action plan, again, there's community facing actions where we're hoping to help the community take action because the targets are community wide. And so we've been engaged in a process to help us prioritize the strategies and actions in the plan, and also set smarter goals. SMART being the acronym for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So set smarter goals and help prioritize the strategies and actions in the plan so that we can be a bit more strategic in how we implement it. We've already been implementing a number of actions, particularly taking advantage of different opportunities that have arisen. And in order to be more strategic, there's some ways that we can further hone and refine the types of things that are proposed in the climate action plan. And then again, we're also working on local sustainable operations, policies, and procedures to help make our running of our buildings, our fleet, our vehicle fleet, landscape management, and procurement of goods and services all be more sustainable. At the bottom, we have the resilience planning piece. And one thing I'll call out is we're just finishing up a pretty intensive vulnerability assessment report, which will help us better understand through climate modeling and looking at our local conditions, what kinds of things we can expect here. And that will inform our planning process, which we're about to get going with to do a climate resilience plan. That'll be a companion companion document to the climate action plan. So again, happy to, if you have more questions about some of these details, happy to come back to it. That was kind of a brief overview of a lot of the work that's currently ongoing. And this is just a more detailed version of the web tool that we have, which I was gonna at one point show, but I'll skip it for now to save time. So climate action and the comprehensive plan update. These are the comprehensive plan, of course, is one of the county's most important guiding documents for setting a vision for how the county develops, what happens within the community and where. And so it's really important to integrate climate action into that. And the Board of Supervisors has really emphasized this in a lot of meetings recently as the comp plan process has been developing, the update process. I know that many supervisors have said, hey, how are you in community development integrating climate action? How are you integrating equity? And so I've been in a lot of communication with colleagues who are responsible for the comprehensive plan update on what that's going to look like and how we can best do that. So in the next few slides, I'm going to share some ideas this is somewhat finger painting. It's not concrete specific projects, but it's more just to give some conversation starters and suggest some ideas of how these different areas of work of the county are interrelated. First off, the pie chart on the right takes the 2018 inventory and just shows the kind of the breakdown of that inventory across the different sectors of emissions. And I wanted to show that because understanding that distribution is important to help us think about how we can integrate climate action more into the comprehensive plan update. Slight color switch, but this is showing the same thing. And one of the details that jumps out to me the most immediately, maybe it jumps out to you as well, is that transportation emissions are actually slightly over 50% of our emissions in the county. Often in more dense urban communities, generally in cities, you'll see that the building sector is the majority of emissions, or at least 50%. in the county, we have more with transportation, which makes sense because of being a much larger geographic area. I wanted to share this interesting graphic that appeared in my colleague's recent report as part of the comp plan update. It was the growth management background report. And they had this graphic of based on American Community Survey from the last 5, from 2015 to 2019, asking folks about how they generally made their way from home to work for their commute to work. And so there's a few interesting things here. On the far left, of course, driving alone is pretty large. It's over 75% was what folks reported. I did want to highlight briefly on the right, interesting to see that in 2015 to 2019, on average, 8.5% of folks in the county were working from home. Of course, that spiked during 2020 and 2021 with COVID, but I'm interested to see if perhaps there will be somewhat of a plateau, even though it's dropping from those spikes during the pandemic. You know, as people have kind of changed their lifestyles to some extent, more folks are working from home and able to do so. Maybe that number stays a little bit higher, which can help with transportation emissions. What I wanted to draw your attention to the most before moving on is the middle 3 numbers, which are all quite low. And in our program, we would love to see those numbers increase. For those numbers to increase, though, you know, we also have to look at how we can improve infrastructure and reduce barriers to people being able to make the choice to take public transportation, walk, or bike. And one thing that I'll mention, this came up in a recent conversation that I was part of earlier this week, which is someone had asked about, you know, well, does walking make sense given that, you know, the county is so big? Like that alone, not too many people are probably going to commute to work unless they're really lucky. And one thing I think is important to mention is that these, particularly the public transit, walking and biking modes, are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And often, you know, there's no bus that's going to drop you off right in front of your building and right in front of your workplace. And so usually walking and biking are kind of important support modes for a good transit system, helping folks get around without cars if they want to do that. So a big question is, how can growth management and land use decisions help us increase those percentages? And likewise, you know, how can they help us reduce barriers to folks making those choices? So this is kind of the finger painting, just a few ideas here. Some of you might have heard the term complete streets. And there's kind of an example of one in the image on the right, which is in kind of the town center of Crozet, or the community center of Crozet, where you have a street where there's space for cars. It's also, you know, a good clearly marked bike lane. There's a good sidewalk for pedestrians, and there's some greenery that provides some shade, makes it, you know, a nice, pleasant space to walk or bike along. So there's real estate, so to speak, for all 3 of those modes, and it's pleasant, you know, for cyclists and pedestrians. Often, you know, the notion of density and mixed use comes up in county conversations. That's certainly a piece of the climate action conversation, of looking at how we can try to increase density and have more mixed use development, so that, you know, if you run out of eggs and you need to, you know, get a dozen eggs or something like that in the middle of the week, how far do you need to go to run that errand? And is there a, you know, store that's small and nearby that you can get to more easily or less easy, or is it less easy for you to do that? So thinking about density, mixed use. Sometimes we talk about infill development, which is the idea of if there's kind of, you know, open, let's say an old parking lot that's not being used, can that be redeveloped in a way that provides more affordable housing for folks, or brings in more mixed use and for local businesses and the like. And then just broadly thinking about, you know, kind of the amount of land that we allot for cars versus transit, cyclists and pedestrians. It's always interesting to me sometimes when I'll go to a shopping center and see that the stores are quite packed inside, and yet be surprised at how many empty parking spaces there are. Or maybe I should say that in reverse. I'll go and it looks like hardly anybody's there because the parking lot is so huge, maybe oversized. And then I go inside and I realize, oh, wow, it's actually really crowded and the line to the checkout counter is really long. So thinking about those kinds of decisions as we, you know, as more developments pop up in the county. Also wanted to mention just a few ideas on buildings, since that's such a large aspect of the county emissions. second to transportation. And just, a question that I think is interesting and helpful for us to think about is how can the comprehensive plan promote electrification, solar energy systems, and adaptive reuse of buildings? What are ways where we can include language in the comprehensive plan that talk about the county's interest in prioritizing those forms of development or those ways of developing? And then also, how can that then inform updates to things like the zoning ordinance or other aspects of the county code? Last one that I wanted to mention, I'm going to kind of skip over waste. Happy to talk about it, but just because it's small here, I wanted to skip it. But I wanted to take a minute to say something about agriculture, because this is a little bit sort of deceptive in we're measuring the emissions from livestock in the county for our agriculture sector. And we are working to see what kind of additional data we can incorporate as we go with doing our emissions, also making sure we can do a apples to apples comparison over time. But it's kind of interesting, the agriculture sector, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector is the full title, seems sort of small and unimportant here. But there's an important side to it, and that has to do with kind of the converse of emissions, which is the notion of carbon sequestration. And so that's trees largely, but other plant life through their breathing process, drawing carbon dioxide down from the atmosphere and fixing it as carbon in the form of sugars and other nutrients in their root systems and also in the soil. So the county has quite a bit of tree cover, and our forests are actually helping us a lot. They're sequestering a lot of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And so thinking about our conservation and stewardship of our natural areas is also a really important piece when I think about intersections between climate action and the comprehensive plan. So what are some ways that you all can get involved? I want to make sure that we get to conversation soon. So it's not just me here talking, but the last couple slides. First off, I wanted to share this exciting area of the county website that I mentioned very briefly a few minutes ago. I worked with a number of colleagues in other divisions and departments to create this environmental stewardship hub. And I should say I was a participant in this effort, but the lead behind the project was my colleague Kim Biasioli from Community Development. She's the natural resources manager, and she's been the lead person spearheading the Stream Health Initiative that some of you might have heard about. And so this idea kind of arose out of that program, and she brought me and a few other folks on to participate. And it's basically an area of our website that's very accessible to visitors to the website to learn more about these county programs listed here, and also to be able to find resources for folks to be able to act at home on your land if you have it, and more broadly in your community. So I'm going to actually leave the PowerPoint for a minute and just scroll through a section of the page for you, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. So we really designed this to try to be user-friendly and accessible in a few ways. One is that if you want to learn about county programs related to environmental stewardship, or find out about resources for residents, both technical resources as well as cost share programs, often the different programs like biodiversity, climate action, clean water, they would be sort of hidden in multiple layers of pages deep within the different department pages on the website. And we wanted a place that would be easier to access. So if you'll have the link from the PowerPoint that's shared with your CAC, but if you're telling a friend about this, if you go to the community tab, you just come over here to learn more about environmental stewardship in Albemarle County. So it's easier to access than some of the department pages. And you can click in to learn more about the county's efforts along these 4 areas. And those will take you to more detailed pages if you do want to kind of go into the weeds. And then there's this slider here of ways that you can make a difference at home, in your community, on your land. And if you click on at home, for example, where you are taken is to a page that has a lot of different ideas. And each of these ideas, let's say Go Solar, for example, has just like a very short description. So we wanted to try to keep the text simple, short, and sweet. But each area has links to more detailed information, access to resources or educational materials, if it's something that you feel serious about and want to check out further. And I'll mention that a number of the different kinds of actions that we include on these pages do have links to cost share programs, or where there are opportunities to learn about ways to get rebates or sort of help with a stewardship that someone might be interested in. So we're excited about the launch of this project and hope it'll be widely used, and we certainly plan to incorporate it into different educational events that we're planning to do in the county. So I wanted to share that with you. The last two things I'll mention is, one, we have this climate resilience planning process coming up that I said something about briefly earlier. So definitely check out the risk and vulnerability assessment when we have that come out. It's a long document. We're also going to be publishing a companion reader that's shorter, a little more colorful and geared towards the layperson. So check out those materials, and then look out for opportunities to participate in the adaptation and resilience planning process. And then lastly, I definitely want to make a plug for my colleagues who are working on the comp plan update. So there's some links in this slide that you can click on later if you're not already connected to this website, but they have a great kind of section of the Engage Albemarle website where you can read background materials and also look out for opportunities to attend events and have your voice heard in terms of the community process. So that's it for me in terms of presentation. Thanks so much for your attention. And I'm really curious just to, hear folks' questions. I'll stop the screen share so we can see each other, but happy to bring something visual up if anybody wants. So what do you think?
Thank you, Gabe. Does anybody have any questions first off?
Karen, were you able to get your microphone working? No. Okay, check your settings. I sent you an email. Check your settings and make sure your microphone is set to Realtek. That's what is with your laptop or computer that you're working. Sorry for interrupting everybody. I just want to make sure.
No, that's great. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay, I see a couple hands. I'll start with Andrew.
I wrote down 4 questions, Gabe, but I'll try and pick my most pressing one. Or my audio working?
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I'm getting a message, a window on my computer that's telling me it's not working. So that's Microsoft. What in looking at other communities that are maybe perhaps further down the road, not that we aren't the vanguard in this, I'm sure. What sort of economic opportunities coexist with what we need to do to address getting, to achieve that goal of zero net emissions by 2050? I just think that's a critical. I wouldn't say one without the other if I were an elected official right now, because the reflex response from so many people is thinking about the impact that's going to have directly on their economic life, and particularly folks at the lower end of the economic spectrum. That's a incredibly valid perspective that I think sometimes maybe some of us are quick to push that off as well. We have to save the planet. Okay, but I need to buy food for my kids. So can you give us some idea of how we might think about the economic opportunity that's associated with these steps that we need to take, both as individuals and maybe as a county government and as businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's sort of, I'll maybe pull on a few strings because I think there's multiple directions one could go with that question. So I'll share a couple things and then we can go further with it if I don't, cover all the main points. One of them is, so the county is looking at centering and prioritizing equitable implementation of the plan. And so that's really important in terms of helping bring folks along in the community, being mindful of the distribution of costs, of some of the costs that are, here in the present, even if there will be future benefits. So one of the ways that we talk about that is, or that we're working on that, is with implementation of something like electrification, trying to encourage folks to switch over to more electric appliances. We partner with the two local organizations, LEAP, the Local Energy Alliance Program, and AHIP, Albemarle Housing Improvement Program, which do work to help folks, particularly in the lower income end, be able to have better insulation in their homes, have more efficient electric appliances. And that ends up often then reducing their costs of heating and cooling afterwards. So that's one way that we're hoping to make sure that we bring everybody along, folks who might not be able to afford that kind of investment upfront. Also on kind of the sort of mutual synergy of strengthening our economy and taking climate action, as opposed to, I think you kind of alluded to, sometimes they're seen as a zero-sum game, which I don't think is true. I think it definitely can be positive sum. And one of the things I think about is how can we strengthen kind of local economies and communities, and connect folks who are getting more interested in or have more need for like fresh produce, local fresh food. How can those folks get more connected with local farmers and gardeners who are producing food, and kind of strengthening those local circles, and reducing some of the way in which our kind of global economy is very dispersed, and getting food from really far away or shipping food really far away. So that's one area that I think there's definitely room for growth in how we can kind of build relationships in the community around things like food, for example, that I think will also help with our efforts to build resilience. Those were kind of the two thoughts that first came to mind. And there's definitely more, but I'll pause there just to kind of see what other thoughts you or others have.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Appreciate your answer.
Okay, I see Craig. You wanna?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a quick question on one of the earlier slides. I was just curious how the actual inventories are calculated or those numbers are arrived at.
Great question. So there's a few different methods for kind of different sectors of emissions. But the basic principle, it gets complicated, but the basic principle is fairly simple. And you take what is called activity data, which activity would just be like an emissions producing activity. So me driving from my house to work and burning gasoline in the car, or burning the furnace to produce heat in my home. Those are both like activities. And then you multiply what's called an emissions factor. And that just refers to how much emissions are produced per unit of energy burned. And then you get your carbon emissions. So it's just that like three-part equation is the basic premise. But then it gets a little more complicated when we look at different some of the different sectors of the emissions pie. So for transportation, the way that we get the data is we use vehicle miles traveled, which is a sum of all the essentially all the miles covered by vehicles on public roads in the community over the course of the year. And that kind of information is collected by Virginia Department of Transportation, VDOT, through the traffic counters that they have throughout public roads in the county. So we take that as the full activity data, and then we have to disaggregate by different types of vehicles, sort of, for example, small and larger trucks that are each burning diesel or gasoline, or light passenger cars that are some of them doing diesel, some of them doing gasoline. So we have to disaggregate by different types of vehicles, but then we can come to this final estimate of what our transportation emissions look like on public roads. We don't include in our transportation estimate off-road vehicle travel or sort of travel on like private roads, just because of the access to data. And then on the side of building energy, which is another big one, that one we get reports from the four main electric utilities in the county, or the four electric utilities in the county, where they'll tell us, how many kilowatt hours, for example, they provided in a given year, and then plug that into a similar type of equation. And similar goes for natural gas for heating, for example.
Okay, thank you. Roger?
Yeah, I was wondering, similar to Craig, what the definitional boundaries are for the information you collect. Is it only like county vehicles that you're measuring, or I think you partially answered this in your answer to Craig. You're all transportation countywide, not just
right. Yeah.
county
So no, good follow-up question there. So the boundary is the geographic boundaries of the county. And that means a couple of different things depending on which sector. So if it's transportation, it's all the vehicle traffic that happened within the county boundaries. We haven't gone there. We haven't gone into the level of detail of trying to subtract like outbound trips or inbound trips or pass through trips. So it's just counting kind of once it crosses the county border, whether it's local travel or regional travel, we capture that. And so that means, we might not ever get to like 0% emissions from transportation because of folks like passing through the county on I-64, for example. For the building energy use one, it's based on the energy that buildings are using on site in the community. And that does account for the fuel being used to generate the electricity, which might be happening outside the county. But for that's counted as part of the county emissions because it's the draw from the grid that our buildings contribute to.
So whenever a private entity provides a benefit, like I was reading that there's a big solar farm planned for southern Albemarle County that could provide electricity to a lot of homes. So the county the county's emissions would benefit from that, even though it's a private action.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, because if it's a large scale utility like that, they're going to be hooked into the electric grid and working with the utilities that serve the area to make sure they're plugged into the grid. So it's an interesting question. Like we would need to. I saw in the proposal they were saying this would be enough electricity that would be the equivalent of roughly half the households in the county, for example, which is a big number to see. And I would need to look in a little bit more to how we would address that in our inventory, because of course in actuality it's like the electrons are fluid. It will contribute overall to the regional grid, and so there might be a question of, well, do we count that exclusively in the county, or does that kind of pool into the overall benefits that we're seeing in the grid? But certainly that would make a big dent as far as we're concerned locally.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Robert, I believe you had a hand raised.
Yeah, well, Roger just mentioned this project, and you've probably seen there was a pretty substantial article in the Daily Progress yesterday about this this proposed solar project. Gabe, I would make one comment with regard to your last comment about the number of homes that this might serve. Typically, the article, for example, states that it's a 138 megawatt project. That's usually the nameplate capacity of the number of panels that are installed, but on an annual average basis, the number of megawatts generated from a facility like this is about 1/3 of the nameplate capacity. So you have to be a little bit careful about quoting the number of homes that it will really serve. I mean, that's just the reality of, when the sun is shining and so on and so forth. But the article noted that there was nothing scheduled with the Planning Commission yet. And so obviously it hasn't gotten to the supervisors as yet, clearly. But I would like to, and perhaps since we can't take any formal action, but maybe we have to do it next time, is to make a motion that the developers come before this committee as a starting point to talk about this project, because these projects do have some issues and we need to be careful. There are issues of whether this is the appropriate piece of land for this kind of project. Are there erosion issues? What potential impacts on immediately nearby groundwater could occur? And specifically, there seems to be, when you look at these solar projects globally, there's more and more concern about decommissioning of these things. I mean, it's 30 years out. These panels have a number of materials in them that certainly cannot get into the groundwater. So the question, things like silver, cadmium, certain heavy metals, and so forth. So certainly one of the issues that is beginning to develop in the solar community is what are the financial assurances or bonding that needs to be required to assure that at the end of the useful life of a facility like this, it doesn't become an environmental liability. And the article mentioned that there's not and I quote here Allison's text, there's not a specific policy regulating permitting for utility scale solar projects in the county, but some supervisors have expressed interest in one. And Supervisor Andrews, I would think that's a very important statement, because I think there are, well, while we certainly are enthusiastic and need to be supportive of alternative non-carbon based renewable energy, it has to be done correctly. And if this is the first large scale utility scale project in the county, which I understand it is, I think it's really incumbent upon the supervisors and the Planning Commission and this group as well to begin the process of looking at this and trying to understand what the long-term implications are, not just the potential number of homes or the carbon offset that this project represents. So I would really like to see, as a starting point, certainly, that the developers come before this advisory committee, and then it moves obviously through the Planning Commission and ultimately to the supervisors. So that's my thoughts on that. So it's really important to do this right from the beginning, and it's not just the initial installation. It has to be a life cycle analysis of what the potential impacts are. So Supervisor Andrews, perhaps you could convey that to Supervisor Price as one of your colleagues in whose district. And in fact, they mentioned Secretary's Road, which I understand is probably quite close to Supervisor Price's home, I believe. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
I don't see any other hands, so I guess I did have a couple things, but I'll just kind of touch on one. What is in the area of development, developing of new neighborhoods and so forth? We see a lot of, and I understand that there's a need to clear cut a lot of these properties because they need to get in utilities and so forth. Is there a plan, or is there some looking at where we can limit the amount of trees that need to be cut down in a development, and try to talk to developers about limiting clear cutting entire properties, because we see that a lot throughout the county. And you mentioned the forestal, you had that slide. And so I just, wanted to touch on that and see if there was anything that on your end you were trying to talk to your colleagues about, trying to maybe come up with some plans to keep that from happening over and over again, because it seems like in my mind.
Yeah, I hear you. Thanks for bringing up that concern, Nathan. And also, Robert, thanks for your comments there. I'll maybe circle back to something in a minute. So yeah, Nathan, with your question, it is definitely an area that we're wanting to work on. And there are some actions in the plan that speak to doing what we can to help incentivize and encourage developers where possible, maybe have some restrictions around that level of clear cutting. And obviously the development community would, have probably some good reasons, like you mentioned, with utilities and stuff like that for why that might be. There's this notion in the county that's been around for a while, which is of low impact development. And my understanding is that term originated more in the sense of looking at stream health and runoff with respect to our watershed. But I think the kind of idea in broader principle is relevant to, thinking about, how can we lighten our footprint when developments go in and try to, not necessarily, like you're saying, clear cut. There's also opportunities to look at, depending on if we have enabling authority from the state, opportunities to look at, can we at least require a kind of replacement of the canopy coverage that may have been taken out in the development process. So that's another area that we're looking to see, where does the county have room for maneuverability there, and what kinds of things are outside the box. So definitely something that's part of a priority within the climate action plan that we're looking to address. And that actually is a good segue. Maybe briefly I could speak to something Robert said, and then Nathan, I think you mentioned you maybe had a couple things. But it kind of segues, because one of the things, like, we certainly would love to not see like robust healthy forest being deforested for solar utilities, for example. And my colleagues and I are actually working on, in part from some feedback from the planners who reviewed a couple of the smaller scale solar utility facilities that were approved over the last year. I've been working with those folks and another colleague on creating kind of solar policy language that we hope to bring to the board sometime later this year. Of course, it might, this development proposal may be happening before then. But where we would look at what we want to prioritize if and when solar is going to happen. So we'd like to kind of frame it as saying, hey, the county is supportive of this. To Robert's point, like we need to be looking at non-carbon sources of energy, and we'd like to see it done in this way. And we want to prioritize projects that are thinking about these kinds of things. So those might include like, having native plant pollinator friendly shrubs in between the panels rather than turf grass, or I've even seen photos of like gravel in between the panels, both of which are much worse for runoff and stream health, water quality, but also thinking of ways where the project can both be generating renewable energy and sequestering carbon and having kind of rebuilding soil health through the plants that are there. I've seen some early research projects on solar facilities that have tried to work in agricultural production of crops that like part sun, part shade, and can be planted beneath the panels and do well in a sort of partial shade environment. So some of that research is maybe on the earlier end, but that's something that we're thinking about in terms of how we want to try to guide solar development in the county, is to kind of do it and also have it done in a way that doesn't compromise local environmental issues that I think both of you have, what you've each said is relevant to. Nathan, did you have another question or comment you wanted to bring up?
I did. I didn't know if anybody else had any other questions or concerns that they would like to address at this time.
Just one quick question on the mix of residential and commercial buildings, which is, it's critical to our tax base to have a healthy mix, right? You don't want to just have too much residential, et cetera. But in terms of the actual carbon footprint today, what percentage of that is from our relatively small commercial building base?
That's a good question. And if you can, Andrew, if you can hold that one while someone else asks the next question, I'm just going to pull up the inventory spreadsheet and I can tell you.
Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to address with Gabe?
Well, here, I brought it up quicker than I thought. So I don't have these actually listed out as percentages, so I would need to do a little quick run on my calculator. But for 2018, the emissions in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent was from residential, it was about 280,000 carbon dioxide equivalent metric tons, excuse me. And for commercial buildings, it was a little over 160,000. So residential was not quite twice the amount of commercial buildings, maybe like 1.5 times as much.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just had one more quick question regarding with transportation. I assume that discussions are going on with, like, say, the school board in regards to their buildings and their transportation, because having 2 kids that are in school and seeing the amount of buses and the amount of miles that those buses drive every day is astronomical. So is there a plan to try to get the school board and schools involved in, trying to move to more efficient vehicles and those things? I'm assuming there are electric buses. So was just wondering if that was something you were looking for towards your net zero, 2050.
Yes, absolutely. The school board just created a advisory committee for environmental sustainability. that's connected with the schools. That is essentially the premise is to help guide the schools towards implementing aspects of the climate action plan that are relevant to them. So we've had a couple meetings so far. It was something the school board had intended to create a couple of years ago, and then just with all the challenges that schools have had with the pandemic, it got a little slowed. But we started meeting this spring. I'm excited so far just to see the kind of conversations we've had and the direction that the work will hopefully take. And that has Supervisor Diantha McKeel and school board member Kate Acuff who are sitting on that committee. The schools have, I believe, through grant money last year they procured 2 electric school buses. And the last I heard was they were looking to procure another 2 to 4 this year. A lot of it is they've been pretty aggressive in the last couple of years going after grant money to try to switch to electric school buses. I think a regular like diesel school bus is several $100,000, and then an electric bus is maybe another couple $100,000 beyond that. So it's maybe like 150% the price. So there's definitely some ways in which we'll need some financial assistance. And fortunately, there have been grant programs that staff in schools have been able to go after. And certainly, I'd like to see us, as much as we can, kind of quicken the pace. Provided that we can create the funds to do so or find the funds to do so.
Okay, great. That's awesome. Okay, does anybody else have any questions?
I just want to add there that coming up on May 23rd, there is going to be, it's not a county vehicles, but it's demonstration at the county offices of electric vehicles of different types, including, I believe, things for maintenance facilities and things like that. So if anybody's interested in seeing in action more electrification.
Yeah, thank you, Supervisor Andrews, for mentioning that. I should have mentioned that. My colleague's been the main lead behind it. But yeah, we're really excited. It'll be next Monday. 5 to 6 will be the kind of invite portion for members of the public. We're going to do a workshop ahead of time with staff to kind of explore different ways of using more right-sized vehicles for work-related tasks. Thanks for mentioning that.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, Gabe, thank you very much. We really appreciate this. It's definitely something that is important, and we need to stay on target with what we're trying to achieve. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Ethan, let me mention one thing about process in response to Mr. Finley's comment about the Woodridge Solar and having that reviewed by the commission and the board. It's a special use permit, and as a special use permit, it's required to have a community meeting. So there will be a community meeting held on that project. It's officially just been submitted this week, so I don't think any decisions made as to where that meeting would be, whether it's going to be some type of remote meeting or whether it would be at the CAC. Sometimes those meetings are held at CACs, but the lead plan reviewer will be working with the planning commissioner and board member from the district to determine how that will be processed. But I just want to let you know there would be a community meeting on that project.
Thank you, David.
It would be great if we'd be notified once that gets firmed up, whether or not it's with the CAC or not. I'd certainly like to hear about it.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure that let Tori know, and I think you'll hear about it one way or the other.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, David.
Yep.
Okay. Next item on the agenda is Planning Commission and Board of Supervisor updates. I guess including budget update. So, Mr. Andrews, do you have anything that you would like to add?
I'm happy to talk about budget, talk about anything you're interested in terms of updates. Obviously, we've had many budget hearings over the course of the spring, and on May 4th, we adopted the fiscal year 23 budget, which begins July 1. It's July 1 to June 30th. And of course, the tax rate for real property remained flat, even though your bills will probably go up because the assessed values have increased. The personal property tax rate dropped 86 cents per hundred because, again, we expect that your personal property valuations, your vehicle valuations in particular, are going to see a dramatic increase due to the market for used cars right now, which is kind of crazy. In addition, the some additional revenues will come in due to an increase in the meals tax up to where Charlottesville was, and an increase of the TOT hotel tax. That's also where Charlottesville has been. And the last in terms of revenue is very small, but important for environmental reasons. 5-cent tax on plastic bags intended to discourage their use and to recognize the effects they have on our recycling in part because they jam up the machines, and we really like to get away from them a little bit more if we can. Obviously, it's not all about bringing revenue, it's about spending it. And it's a big budget and there are a lot of things in the budget. And so it's hard to sort of go through all the different pieces, but a big part, of course, are capital projects. And the schools are the largest part of our budget, of course, both operations and then a good chunk of capital. We have in the works a new high school center being planned and eventually 2 elementaries. I bring that up right away because we talked about the effect of the schools on the climate action and transportation in and out of schools. And of course, one of the big projects that is relevant for 5th and Avon is Southwood. That's our neighborhood. And Southwoods has, among other things, proffered some land that could be considered for a school, but it's not clear that it's a suitable property for a school. There are a need for eventually 2 more elementaries, particularly because Mountain View is way overcrowded. And while we've tried to, put in for bringing it up to its current capacity more easily, to get the capacity up to where it is now with Southwoods, it'll be even more. So we're kind of behind the 8 ball on that, I think, and the school board knows it, we know it, and we want to do something about it. So that's a big part. Of course, another thing in the 5th and Avon area is Biscuit Run. So this budget included money to get Biscuit Run started, phases 1A and 1B, including entrance and parking and all. But then 1B includes fields. So you may have heard of substantial controversies over Darden Howe fields, which were essentially unresolved after several meetings discussing them. This is probably going to come up again in terms of Biscuit Run. There's capacity for a lot more soccer fields and playing fields generally there. And what the mix of those fields will be is yet to be seen. The Southern Convenience Center, which is a bit down the road, but still might be more convenient for some, should be opening up in a couple of years, if not sooner. It's underway. And then there are plans for a Northern Convenience Center. So those are some of the things that highlight from the capital improvement plan. There also are many other things: court expansion, broadband funding, which is actually a pass through from government funding for rural broadband, and eventually we'll expand that into enhancing broadband in the non-rural areas where it needs to be enhanced. So there are what we call core systems modernization is a big part of the budget, and that's trying to get our systems up to speed, particularly in a planning department and approval process for building permits and for taking plans through and getting feedback and having that whole process run a lot smoother and more efficiently. We also have, and also managing capital projects better. We also have a substantial amount of funding going into our workforce because they have been hit hard, and we're down quite a few people. The number of vacancies is way over what we would want to see, and that's growing particularly problematic with respect to the Albemarle County Police Department. need to attend to that. So we may be looking at ways in which we can, to remain competitive. We need to do that. So that's a quick and dirty. If there are questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Are there any questions for Mr. Andrews? I don't see any hand raised, so, all right, well, thank you. I don't think there are any members of the planning commission present today, so I don't think.
Yeah, Karen Firehawk, I know, was traveling. I don't know what happened to Fred and Donna.
So with that, we will just say announce that the next CAC meeting is tentatively scheduled for Thursday, June 16th. Opportunities for the public to access and participate in electronic meeting will be posted at a later date, in accordance with emergency ordinance number 20A16, and open meeting requirements of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. And with that, we can adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you.
Good job, Nathan.
Thank you, Dave.
Yes, well done, Nick.